Good evening, April 14th, 2025. This is Mary Conley, and I'm going to go over something again on the encounter with Theodore Bundy. I figure I'm going to outlive these people. I had a pretty wild life in my time. I'm in the middle of doing taxes for people at the free tax site. By the way, we have 2 weeks off because it's at a college, and they were comparing the three major. We're number 3 in Duval. And we have 943, by the way. They don't count 20, 21, 22. I've got to start cleaning up some of the bad records. So people never showed back up. They were supposed to go home and get a 1099-R or their Social Security statement, and they just have not come back. But that's a whole different story. Okay, I'm going to take you back to 1967. Debbie wanted to go to summer band. My mom got a clarinet, obviously at a pawn shop, because she knew I probably wasn't going to stay with it. In this instance, I don't think this was my idea. Choir at Cedar Hills Baptist Church was my idea. Baton twirling earlier, maybe in the 66 when we were like in 6th grade, that was probably my idea. Summer band wasn't so much my idea. And we were going to Daytona. I had figured this out, Mrs. McKisney. I figured it out because I had a red surfer shirt that I know I got at Woolworths in Daytona Beach. And I could not have been wearing that in August when my 2 aunts and my grandmother had a picture of me at Mayport in August of 67 and a run into Bundy in 1967 in June. Because that meant we had to go to Daytona some earlier time. So what I think happened is my dad usually took 2 weeks, and we go to Philadelphia or we go to Tupelo and Ecru, Mississippi, Pontotoc. To see my grandmother, we'd just have 2 whole weeks, or we'd go to Daytona and have 2 whole weeks because he had 2 weeks from the base. And this year he must have taken a week in June of 67 and taken another week when his family came, my Uncle Jerry, my Aunt Shirley, who's still living, and my Aunt Opal and Grandmom Conley, and I think Aunt Doll, I don't know who was in the picture, Aunt Opal, maybe Aunt Bobby and Grandmom Conley were standing there, and I had a fedora, which I also picked up at Daytona Beach. So me and Debbie go up to summer band. It's early June, maybe June 17th, I don't know the date. And it's summer band, and I have looked this up. Debbie had on a get-up with a white peasant top, frayed blue jeans, probably Hager, what do you call them? I don't know, Wrangler. And she had them frayed a good 2 inches, okay? So she might have been wearing like flat sandals. I'm extrapolating now. I'm trying to figure out what happened. There had to have been breaks. Maybe a bathroom break, maybe a snack break. Maybe you bought some apple slices and peanut butter, or maybe there was a vending machine with Lance crackers. I don't know. But maybe at least a bathroom break. She must have run into Bundy outside of the band shell. And she might have had, the type of sandals that go between your toe, like your big toe and your next toe. Maybe it was cutting into her foot and she didn't want to walk that mile home. And she might have been saying, oh, we've still got another hour. And he might have said, oh, I'm here for an interview. I'm going to be the coach next year. I'm here for an interview. I'm going to be coach next year. I'm going to be coaching her. I'm going to be the English teacher. I don't know what he told her. She knows. She knows. And then we're walking home, and I'm wearing my brother's Gant shirt and pedal pushers that I had frayed. They were polyester, so you didn't phrase them very good. I remember those shorts. They weren't shorts. I just frayed them at the knees. Okay. She stopped at the bleachers, and I thought, what in the world? I wanted to go home because I knew we were going to Daytona. Wasn't that interested in band, but I know there had to be breaks where people, and I remember Miss Russell showing me the key, how to put the instrument together and where the keys are on the clarinet, and you had to put it together and there was a spit thing, and the reed and everything. Debbie may have gone out of the classroom. I mean, you can't control these people. It's summertime, right? If it was 2 or 3 hours, there had to be a bathroom break. Maybe they just took bathroom breaks as needed. I don't know. We were 12 going on 13, so it wouldn't be like elementary school, a little bit higher than that. But she must have run into him out there, and he must have said something, well, if I see you, I can give you a lift, which seems appropriate, but not really appropriate. He was wearing tan shorts. I don't know if he had a shirt on at that time. She had to have seen him before. She stopped at the bleachers, and I'm thinking, what the hell? You know, that's my little mind thinking, what the heck? And she must have said something. I said, well, I'll get us a ride. Maybe she was complaining about her shoes or something. Her sandals might have been cutting between her toes. And she was pretty developed for a 13-year-old. Anyway, I go across the street, across from the baseball field. There's a turn there, and I go across the street, and I'm pretending to hitchhike. I see a car that looks like a Stern mother's car. She had a green Oldsmobile with the fishtails. This was wider though and larger in the back, so I think it might have been a Mercury. It must have been something else, but it kind of reminded me of Miss Mock's car. Sylvia was also taking summer band. I said, oh, we're going to get in trouble, because I think I told Debbie, well, I'll get us a ride. And I go across the street. Then all of a sudden, this bright red new Volkswagen, and I don't care what Mr. Brown, he says, I don't care what, in 1967, that was a little bit unusual to see a shiny red Volkswagen with silver bumpers, no black strip, and a black and white looking tag, and it's over there, about 50 feet from me. So I said, oh, okay. And I even said, hey, naked, because he wasn't wearing a shirt, and he obviously had a mole on his neck somewhere. And he goes over there, Debbie gets off the bleachers, and immediately starts talking to him. And I think she even handed him a note with her phone number. How she did that, I don't know, because she may have had a piece of paper, but I don't think we had pens. She was taking flute, I was taking clarinet. So I'm looking like Rasputin in my brother's Gant shirts and pedal pushers, and she's wearing Wrangler jeans tied around her and a white peasant top with eye hooks. She had a bob, and she's talking to this guy. And she says, get in. And I said, no, Debbie, it's just pretend. It's just pretend. But what I didn't realize, because when I was standing on that corner, I don't even think he saw me. He might have heard me say, hey, naked, but it was like he made a beeline to where Debbie was at the bleachers. He pulled it up, jumped the curb, and was right there at the bleachers as if it was pre-planned. So you're going to have to ask her why she had been talking to this guy. And you say, well, how do I know it's Bundy? You don't forget. You can ask Debbie here. You do not forget this man when you've seen his face. So anyway, she says, get in. And I said, no. No. We're just pretending. So she moved this little eye hook looking thing, not eye hook, it looked like a concave looking thing at the seat, and the seat would go down. And I said, Debbie, it's just pretend. You know, even though he seemed to be a grown man, I always said 20 to 22. And he seemed suave and sophisticated and stuff. He seemed okay. So anyway, I thought for a second, and I said, okay. So I got in the back, and Debbie got in the front. And then I said, there's books back here. And he said, just move the books. And as I said before, one of them appeared to be a concordion. Is that what it's called? Where there was English on one side and hieroglyphics on the other. English on one side, hieroglyphics on the other. There was a pale yellow polo shirt on the ground of the car. I moved it because I didn't want to step on it. And, you know, my dad did not wear polo shirts. He wore Old Navy shirts, so they ripped apart, T-shirts. He didn't play golf. Anyway, it was a polo. He was wearing khaki colored shorts. The steering wheel was super large. He was thin. His knees were knobbly. He seemed to have a tan. And I remember that because I remember, how do you have a tan and it's so early in June? But anyway, he seemed to have a tan. He had a mole on his neck somewhere. His hair was cut in a boy cut, but it was very thick, almost kinky. So Debbie sits in the front passenger seat and I'm in the back. I moved these things out of the way. He said, just move the books. I said, there's books back here. He said, just move the books. And then he takes off to go around the baseball field. We come to Lamoille. I've opened my clarinet case. It is a purple velvet. It seemed to me it was purple velvet. And I open it up and I'm looking at it. So it must have been very early in the class. I didn't even know my instrument very well. I didn't even know the name brand of it. So he turns left to go towards West Gannett, where there's now an Amazon. It used to be a Kmart. It used to be a field with pecan trees, and it belonged to Tower Hardware and a few cattle out there, a few cows walking around. That's where we would usually come. There's a sidewalk to the right. That's where we walked. Crossing Blanding had to be a little dangerous even back then. But anyway, he came there, and he pulled a revolver. It was a silver revolver. And I looked at Debbie, and her lips were tight, and she wasn't talking. And I looked at him, and I could see his face in the rearview mirror. For a minute, I thought it was like an Avanti, which another car I'd got into, which I shouldn't have at 12 going. But the Avanti's mirror was on the dashboard. First minute, it looked like the mirror was on the dashboard. It was so upsetting. And his eyes were black, and his eyebrows went across his forehead like one giant eyebrow. His eyes were black. And then I noticed a very bad odor. It smelled like a sweet, crappy hobo stink, like somebody hadn't bathed, and you could smell urine, sweat, and fecal material. That's how it smelled, stinky hobo stink. And then I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Theodore." And I said, "Theodore," because it was just so pretentious. I mean, you don't say Walter, we said Walt. Gregory is Greg. Geraldine is Jerry. We didn't say Theodore, it just sounded pretentious. I said, "Theodore," and I looked at the windows, and there were teardrop shaped, and you couldn't get out. There was no back door. And I said, "What's your last name?" And he said, "Bundy." And I said, he was quiet. That when they were talking, I couldn't hear because he was so quiet. But I said, "Oh, your name is Bundy, like my clarinet, and your gun is silver, like Debbie's flute." I said, "Debbie's father's an admiral at NASA," because Mrs. Hogue was always saying that her husband was a CO, and ours were just enlisted. My father was enlisted Chief Petty Officer, ADC, which I think is affair to camp. ADC, affair to camp. He was like a liaison between the officers and the enlisted. But he was also an aircraft mechanic, so I don't know if it was an AOC or ADC, but anyway. He was on the Roosevelt and the Saratoga and all these different ships. He's an aircraft person. But anyway, I said, "Debbie's father's an admiral at NASA." I said, "If you're looking for girls, you ought to go up to the high school," because I didn't know what was wrong with this dude. And then I said, "You ought to meet Vicky and Jeannie. They're older, and they're already out on their own. They're so pretty." I said, "You ought to meet Debbie's sister, Vicky and Jeannie. They're pretty, and they're already out on their own," which wasn't exactly true. Debbie's mother was bipolar, manic depressive, they called it. And she had had electric shock therapy, and she looked exactly like Elizabeth Taylor. I swear to God, Mrs. Hogue looked exactly like Elizabeth Taylor. But anyway, this was 10 years and 8 months before Leslie Palmer ran into him. And I kind of vaguely got acquainted with the Palmers too from the church, Cedar Hills Baptist Church. And I think in my 6th grade, I was a Steve Palmer. So she must have had 2 older brothers. And Johnny worked at the construction site where they were building the Confederate points. And that's a whole different story. But he told me later, he said, well, because it was raining, they had stopped early because of OSHA, you weren't allowed to work in the rain, so they had stopped earlier, and that's why her brother was able to find her at Kmart. But that's a whole different story. That was decades later, and I told Johnny, if there was only one person, Kathleen don't want to get involved. Debbie's quite wealthy. Her husband was a bioengineer, and he's recently deceased a couple years now. And I don't want to bother these people. But now I'm suspecting Jeannie, the oldest sister, not Jeannie the mother, because it was Jeannie and then Jean and Jeannie, and then Vicky and Debbie. They had more of the Norwegian look, like Joe, like her father, Hogue, Hogue, which is Nordic, right, or some Finnish or something, I don't know, Hogue. Anyway, he was a commander. He was at NASA, but they were separated. But I didn't say that. But you don't forget it. And then some way, when he made the turn onto West Gannett, he put the gun away, and he tapped the steering wheel like this 3 times. And the gun, when he held it, it was like this. And he had black hair on his wrist, a very thin wrist, very long fingers. And I don't know what else to say, because I get tired of it. I know that I will outlive it, and God is my witness that that man was here. And I've showed you the people that own the Gator Lodge, the girl that lived there, the Kings. She said her mother had seen him when she was a child. That could have been 68. So he may have driven up from Miami after the convention and was in 68. And I hate to say this, there is some connection between Debbie and that man. Did he call? They had 2 phones, which was very unusual. I think they had a phone in the kitchen, and they had trim line near the bedrooms. that was kind of unusual. That was state of the art. We had one phone by the the kitchen table in the dining room. It was a TV telephone stand. It was a wrought iron telephone. That's what you had. There was the one phone in the whole house. But somehow Jean, Debbie's mother, had somehow gotten. It was the same number, but she had two phones, one in the kitchen and one in the bedroom. That was kind of unusual. But there were three women in that house. It was Vicky, Debbie, Jeannie, and Jean. Mr. Ho was in Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, Anyway, NASA. I don't know what else to say. The reason I want to show the connection to Florida is there is connection. If you're Mr. Simpson, the way the man drove around Duval, he knew where he was driving. He went to the Roller Dome. He went to the Ramona Evangel Church. I don't remember what it's called, but it's over Verona. They still give out meals. He wanted money and a meal, and they said, no, if you're going to get money, you're going to have to do some errands. And then he shows up at the Roller Dome. Then he was out on Normandy near the cemetery, and some girl named Brenda Matthews said she had a red and white Oldsmobile. Kind of fancy, red and white, and it was dark, but she was hungry, so she went into a mom and pop store, which it wasn't a very well lit. And she said there was this dirty white van, and she came out of that store that night, and the back door was open. And she said for some reason it made the hair on her skin crawl, and this was 1978. And she said she kicked the door, and she went around and got in her car and took out of it. She kicked the door shut. God, more power to her. And I'm thinking he may have gone in that cemetery because they have to use certain soil, and Florida's just white sand, and they have to truck in a certain type of soil for the graves. And he may have wiped that car down with that soil too, to make it look different, like a work van or something. He was prowling. He was in the Shell station on Roosevelt. He was on Ernest Street at that Holiday Inn. He was at the Holiday Inn in Orange Park. And there was another woman at Wilson and Parvin who said she was walking between Wilson Boulevard, she was on Wilson. She was walking between Hugh Edwards and Parvin. And this was on Next Door Neighbor. And as she said, my brother's girlfriend at the time, was just out of high school or high school age. And she was walking along Wilson between Hugh Edwards and Parvin. By the way, about a block and a half from Debbie's home. And she said the van had approached her. This is the same day as Leslie Parmenter, but she turned and went the other way, and he couldn't back up in traffic. So from Lane Avenue, Hugh Edwards to Lane, or somehow Lane is right up the road too. Lane intersects with Normandy. Out Normandy, you can go to Green Acres. Green Acres is at Hammond Boulevard, I think. Is out there on the west side. You could get lost in Jacksonville so easy, but whatever he was doing, he never seemed to be getting lost. And Debbie's home, her mother sold that home in 1975 and had moved to Confederate Point Apartments. She lived at Confederate Point. There was, what are they called? The Reserve? No. Oh, there's 3 apartment situations over there. The Confederate Point Apartments, and then there's southern names I can't think of, but there's 3 apartment complexes in. And then they built the houses. The houses were being built in the 60s. That whole subdivision was just marshland on sort of an island like thing. As a matter of fact, in June of 1967, those constructions had begun. Not the homes, but the roadways and sewer lines were being built over in Confederate Point, just off the tree line from Jeb Stuart. I remember a playbill in my hand talking about West Side Story. I remember the cafeteria. We didn't have a lot of air conditioning in our rooms either. I remember one teacher saying his name was Rigetko, and it was OK Tiger spelt backwards. And he told us all about the bombing at Pearl Harbor and how the men were swimming around in diesel fuel and they couldn't fit through the portholes. Some of them could fit through the portholes. Some of the others had to go down with the ship. They couldn't get out as the ships were sinking. And he said they would come up for air and it would burn their hide because the water was on fire from all the fuel. And he told us about that. I remember things. I'm not stupid. And I may be a little autistic, but I remember things. And I'll never forget it. And I know I'll outlive these people that say act like I'm some kind of autistic freak. I'm telling you the truth.
My IQ fluctuates between 121 and 133. I'm not stupid. I remember this. Now, if you people cannot get this straight and figure out that this man traveled, I think he traveled in 74 and killed that girl. And here's something Mr. Fisher ought to think about real hard while he's still got some brain cells. In August of 1974, he let Liz Clover use his Chevron card. Right after he'd killed them girls in Lake Sammamish, he let her use a Chevron card. And he used her vehicle to go to Seattle for the last little bit of that job. He had to wrap it up. The DES or whatever, he had to wrap that job up. And I'd like to know what color her Volkswagen was in 74. Was it blue, gray, or was it tan also? Because I think he knew somebody at the Department of Emergency Services was on to him. And he wanted to say, yeah, I got a Volkswagen, but it's light blue or it's gray. You know, whatever color her vehicle was, if it was tan, it don't make sense. But he might, I don't know why he would do that. That's very peculiar. And then he goes to Utah, and his little brother said, and he sent me home. Well, Glenn was with him at first, and then Richard was with him. And Richard said it was at an airport he acted bizarre. So if he had somebody use his Chevron card, because he had learned how to do it the month before, that's all it would take. Or if he bribed the person and said, look, I'm going to pay you now and I'll give you a pack of beer. And then you slide that through a day or two later, because he wanted to cover his tracks. And he could cover his tracks if he let somebody use his Volkswagen for a couple of days. It was only the girl missing here around the 25th or 26th or whatever is September. And it was a red Volkswagen. A lot of things he did. He even took off in an orange-red Volkswagen to go back west, to mimic the trip he had taken back in 67. He said he learned to sleep in them things and stuff. Y'all better figure this out. I don't like holding secrets. I don't want secrets. He never would talk because he was a prick. Something was wrong with him. But I'm telling you, there's a good possibility that he killed Virginia Helms. Her people still living here somewhere. She probably got brothers and sisters in the 60s and 70s and said, where is she? What happened? I'd like to know how her clothes were laid out, how she was killed, and then this Mr. said, he never had guns. That's the stupidest crap. He was burglarizing houses at 12 and 13 years old. He had the paper out. He knew who was going on vacation. Back then, people didn't even lock their doors. And even if they did, all you had to do was lift a screen out and you go in and out. And sometimes if you push real hard on the French doors, they would open anyway. Anybody knows that. This was the 60s. And he would notice their cars going if they went on vacations. Only now one of the creators said how many trips they were taking to and from Pennsylvania. You know they had to take some, thinking, oh, they were so poor, they couldn't do nothing. No, people went home for funerals, people went home for weddings, and sometimes people just made a trip of the family so they could see their grandparents. You know, Mr. Bundy had relatives all in North Carolina. They could go to Philadelphia and North Carolina, head back. If you got a federal job, you've got at least 2 weeks. All right, I'm done. I've said everything I can say. My friend is Debbie Harry, and a few of us that say we know who we saw. Well, she doesn't describe it as a Volkswagen. What the hell? What difference does it make if he was a Carmagia or a Opel Kadett? He could take cars right and left. Back then, people put the keys in the glove. That guy with the orange Volkswagen in Tallahassee, he had a baby. He didn't want to deal with the key. He had come out of the service. He just left the key there. Many nights, Bundy already knew about that car, besides not just because he watched a movie that night. He knew about that car ahead of time. That was going to be the car he used to head back to San Francisco and mimic the trip. The Lake Sammamish may have been me and Debbie. It was like me and Debbie. He had 2 people in that car and didn't do it. So all the rest of the time he said, I've got to go back and do that. But when he came back to Jacksonville, he realized the Hogues had sold that home. And he never knew exactly where I lived. Thank God I was between jobs and working down to the Port Authority and stuff. It saved my life, right? All right, thank you. Kathleen and Debbie were in Gainesville. That's right. They were in Gainesville at the time. Thank you very much. Y'all, there's something wrong with you people. There is something wrong with you, and I think some of you people know it. You say, we don't want to upset these people. They've got mental illness. You're damn right. That Jeannie, she is a witch. No matter what she thinks she's doing right, even if a son was born, whatever the hell happened, the truth should come out. God knows the truth. For God's sakes, tell the truth. It's nearly 60 years.